I couldn't sleep that night. My conversation with Lena and Kenji, my glib invocation of Schrödinger's paradox, echoed in my mind. It was one thing to discuss it as an abstraction in a lecture hall. It was another entirely to see it manifest, however symbolically, in the courtyard below my window. The image of that canvas tarp, a shroud over a quantum state, haunted me. Before dawn, I gave up on sleep, dressed in the pre-dawn chill, and made my way down to the service courtyard. The campus was silent, bathed in the cold blue light that precedes the sun. My footsteps were loud on the cobblestones. The tarp lay where the workers had left it, a grim little tent of uncertainty. My heart hammered against my ribs, a foolish, unscientific reaction. I was a physicist, about to make an observation, to collapse the wave function. I reached down, my fingers hesitating on the rough canvas. I steeled myself for the sight of a small, broken body. I pulled the tarp away. For a moment, I saw only the wreckage, splintered planks of oak, twisted nails, the dust of destruction. Then a flash of orange. Sitting calmly atop the largest, most solid piece of the shattered crate was the cat. It blinked its green eyes at me, let out a soft, questioning meow, and began to groom a pristine white paw, utterly unconcerned. A wave of dizzying relief washed over me. It was the improbable outcome, the unlikely branch of reality. Kenji had been right. It had darted away. It was alive. The system had collapsed into the most merciful of its possible states. I knelt, smiling, extending a hand. The cat purred and rubbed its head against my knuckles, and that's when I saw it. Beneath the very plank the cat was sitting on, trapped and pressed into the wood grain by the immense force of the impact, was a tuft of ginger fur, identical to the cat's own, and next to it a dark, unmistakable stain of dried blood. The evidence was absolute, irrefutable. The cat had been crushed. There was no physical way for that fur and blood to be in that position, under that weight, if the cat had escaped. I stared from the damning evidence of its death to the living, breathing, purring creature in front of me. Both were real, both were present, a paradox made manifest. The universe had not chosen one reality over the other. It had impossibly chosen both. The wave function had collapsed, but echoes, tangible and real, of the alternative outcome remained. The cat was alive, but the proof of its death was sealed in the wreckage. I stood there, the cold morning air forgotten, and I thought not of physics, but of the law. How could a detective solve this? How could a jury render a verdict? Presented with irrefutable proof of death and the irrefutable proof of life, what could they possibly conclude? They would be forced to choose one truth and discard the other, to declare a piece of physical reality inadmissible simply because it contradicted their narrative. And in that moment, I understood the true soul-crushing horror of our new age. This little courtyard, with its impossible cat, was a microcosm of the entire world. It was the reason men like Miles Finch were breaking. Detectives used to be gods, or at least the closest secular equivalent we had. Men and women, often cloaked in an aura of weary cynicism and sharp-tailored suits, armed with the twin cannons of logic and motive. They could walk into a room saturated with chaos, despair, and the lingering scent of violence, and through meticulous observation and deductive reasoning stitch together a coherent narrative of clarity. They were the modern-day oracles, reading blood spatters like sacred texts, interpreting the silent testimony of fingerprints, deciphering the tangled grammar of human desperation. They were admired, sometimes feared, and almost always respected as the final arbiters of earthly justice. But not anymore. In the dawning light of this new bewildering age, they began to look like ghosts haunting the corridors of their own precincts. Hollow-eyed, perpetually underslept, their faces etched with a peculiar mixture of frustration and a deeper, more existential dread. Some sought solace in the bottom of a bottle, the amber liquid a temporary balm against the relentless tide of the inexplicable. Others simply quit, trading their badges for quieter, saner lives, unable to reconcile their training with a world that no longer played by the rules. A few, disturbingly, vanished themselves, not in the quantum sense, at least not yet, but simply walked away, swallowed by the anonymity of cities, their desks left neat, their case files forever open. In this emergent world, a world that was beginning to earn the whispered, half-terrified moniker Quantamund, detectives had become relics. They were the paleontologists of a deterministic past, their tools and methods increasingly ill-suited to excavate truths from a landscape where cause and effect had become a probabilistic crapshoot.
I remember the shift with a visceral clarity. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but rather a slow, grinding erosion, like watching a magnificent cathedral built on the bedrock of reason crumble stone by stone under an invisible siege. Case after case, initially appearing straightforward, would stall, then spiral into intractable enigmas. Investigations mutated into Kafkaesque theater, where every lead was a blind alley, every clue a red herring leading to a paradox. Evidence would flagrantly contradict itself, a weapon found in two places at once, fingerprints belonging to individuals confirmed to be deceased for years. Witnesses under oath would recall events that never happened with unshakable conviction, or entirely forget crucial details of things that undeniably did. Surveillance footage, once the gold standard of objective proof, would glitch at critical moments, frames missing, images blurring into nonsensical static, or sometimes, chillingly, showing alternative, contradictory sequences of events, as if reality itself were flickering between channels. Alibis became quantum states, simultaneously true and false, their validity dependent on which collapsing timeline one chose to observe, or which version of events the universe arbitrarily decided to solidify. Detectives found themselves under siege, not just from the baffling, impossible nature of the crimes they were tasked to solve, but increasingly from the very public they had sworn to protect. The bedrock of trust between law enforcement and the citizenry began to crack and then shatter. Public opinion, amplified by the relentless 24-hour news cycle and the echo chambers of social media, turned venomous. You could hear the rising tide of anger and fear in the hushed conversations in cafes, in the frustrated outbursts in courtrooms, on the indignant tirades of late-night talk show hosts and viral online commentators. They're incompetent, the lot of them. Corrupt. Clearly, they're covering something up. Bought off by powerful interests who don't want the truth known. They're hiding something vast, something terrible. They know more than they're letting on. God help the poor, dedicated soul assigned to a high-profile case in this new era. If the victim was a politician whose policies had courted controversy, a beloved artist whose work defined a generation, a pioneering scientist on the cusp of a breakthrough, or worse, a universally adored public figure, a symbol of stability in an unstable world, the outcry was immediate, visceral, and often violent. Protests erupted outside police stations. Mobs, fueled by grief and suspicion, demanded instant answers, instant justice. Threats, both veiled and explicit, flooded official phone lines and personal inboxes. Lawsuits, alleging negligence or conspiracy, piled up. Riots, spontaneous and destructive, flared in cities already on edge. It didn't matter if the detective assigned had a spotless record, a career built on integrity and successful convictions. The public, desperate for certainty in a world rapidly losing it, demanded justice, or at least the comforting illusion of it.
But illusions, however fervently desired, don't last long when reality itself is unraveling at the seams, when the very laws of physics seem to be in open rebellion against common sense. That was the turbulent, supercharged climate when Inspector Miles Finch stepped, or rather was reluctantly thrust, into the epicenter of the storm. If anyone possessed the intellectual firepower and sheer tenacity to staunch the bleeding, to impose some semblance of order on the encroaching chaos, it was Miles Finch. He was already a legend in a world that was fast developing an allergy to legends, preferring instead the fleeting fame of internet personalities and the easily digestible narratives of conspiracy. Born in the gritty working-class neighborhoods of Bristol, a stark contrast to his later impeccably tailored Savile Row suits, he possessed an intellect that had blazed through Oxford, leaving a trail of confounded tutors and shattered academic records. Finch was the kind of man who made entrenched aristocrats and complacent bureaucrats deeply uncomfortable. Razor-sharp in his analysis, infuriatingly, almost supernaturally correct in his conclusions, and never particularly interested in patiently explaining the intricate latticework of deductions that led him there. He didn't suffer fools gladly, or at all, and his patience for institutional inertia was famously non-existent. He solved his first major case at the precocious age of 23, while still technically a junior analyst. He hadn't just stumbled upon a clue, he'd meticulously unraveled an illegal deep-state surveillance network embedded within the UK's own Ministry of Defence, a network so cunningly concealed it had operated undetected for years. He did not by cracking codes, but by noticing a subtle, almost imperceptible anomaly in the power consumption logs of a supposedly disused sub-basement, cross-referencing it with unusual data traffic patterns that everyone else had dismissed as benign system noise. At 28, he dismantled an international art forgery ring that had baffled authenticators and law enforcement across 3 continents. His breakthrough came not from chemical analysis or historical research, but by identifying a single, anachronistically modern microabrasion on the canvas of a supposedly 17th-century masterpiece, a mark consistent only with the type of synthetic fiber used in a specific brand of cleaning cloth manufactured after 2010. He then used this tiny inconsistency to backtrack the forger's entire supply chain. But the Riyadh window murder was the case that elevated his reputation to near-mythic status. A high-profile arms dealer lay shattered on the pavement 40 stories below his penthouse. The scene was pristine: locked door, no signs of struggle, an open window, a half-finished bottle of rare scotch. The local authorities, the embassy, even the victim's own security team had rushed to declare it suicide. Finch arrived, summoned by an agency that cared only for truth, not politics. He stood in the penthouse, his silence unnerving, his gaze dissecting every detail. The angle of the furniture, the placement of the victim's personal effects, the way the desert wind whispered through the open window. Then, with surgical precision, he asked a single question. Why would a man who just smoothed the shoulders of his tailored jacket onto its valet stand, a man who took obsessive care in his appearance, then leap to his death in rumpled clothing? The room froze. That one observation shattered the illusion. The jacket had been hung with deliberate care, yet the victim's shirt was disheveled, an impossible contradiction for a man moments from suicide. Finch had seen what no one else had. The killer, in their haste to stage the scene, had overlooked the psychology of compulsion. The victim would never have left his jacket pristine while his body was in disorder. From there, the case unraveled like a thread pulled from a tapestry. The suicide was a cover for a blackmail operation involving stolen intelligence, a meticulously staged crime undone by a single fatal oversight, one that only Finch's razor-sharp mind could detect. He was more than an investigator. He was a scalpel cutting through lies, exposing the raw nerve of truth beneath. And in Riyadh, once again, he proved that no deception, no matter how flawless, could withstand his brilliance. But even the sharpest, most resilient blades can snap when struck against something impossibly hard, something that defies the very nature of steel. The case that finally broke him, or at least forced him to confront the horrifying limits of his extraordinary intellect, arrived like a harbinger of the new epoch, just a few months after the first truly inexplicable anomalies began to multiply globally. The deaths occurred on October 25, 2025. The media, with its unerring instinct for dramatic shorthand, swiftly dubbed it the Trinity Tragedy. A name soaked in melodrama, yes, but given the circumstances, perhaps not entirely undeserved. 3 simultaneous deaths. 3 prominent brothers. 3 different continents, 3 vastly different environments. 3 initially baffling, yet on closer inspection, utterly impossible causes. At first, frantic, disjointed glance, nothing obvious connected them beyond their shared surname, Marquez, and their co-ownership of a sprawling, diversified global conglomerate. But as the initial reports coalesced, the true chilling nature of the events began to emerge. The first to be reported, due to the dramatic setting, Damien Marquez, 54, the youngest brother and the technological visionary of the family empire, overseeing their cutting-edge AI and quantum computing research divisions. He died on a pristine ski slope in Zermatt, Switzerland, beneath the iconic gaze of the Matterhorn. It had been, by all accounts, a perfect alpine day. A brilliant, cloudless sky of impossible blue, crisp, dry powder snow. Witnesses, including his ski instructor, described Damien carving elegant, joyful turns through the fresh powder, looking like a man half his age, a plume of fine snow trailing behind him. And then, a bolt from the blue. Literally, a searing flash of lightning, impossibly birthed from a sky devoid of even a wisp of a cloud for hundreds of miles. One moment, he was a vibrant figure of energy and grace. The next, he dropped, a charred, lifeless form on the immaculate white. The mountain remained untouched, the air preternaturally calm, the only sound the distant, horrified shouts of onlookers. There was no storm, no preceding rumble of thunder, just a single lethal discharge from an empty heaven. The second report trickled in from Tokyo. Elliot Marquez, 58, the charismatic public face and chief negotiator of Marquez Global. He had been attending an exclusive, high-stakes private investor dinner in a private room atop one of Shibuya's glittering skyscrapers. The cause of death: choking. Specifically, on a piece of exquisitely marbled premium Wagyu beef. Mundane, tragically common, yet the details were unsettling. According to the maitre d', a distinguished man in his late 60s who recounted the events with trembling hands and a voice thick with shock, Elliot hadn't been in any distress. He had just raised his glass, apparently to make a toast. But instead of addressing his fellow diners, he had looked towards an empty chair at the far end of the long, polished table. He'd smiled, a strange, knowing smile, and said clearly, "Nobody's there. What a joke, young man." Then he began to laugh, a hearty, unrestrained laugh that quickly turned into a strangled cough, then a desperate silent struggle for air. No one noticed immediately. It looked, for a horrifically long moment, as if he were merely overcome with mirth. By the time they realized the grim reality, it was too late. The Heimlich maneuver, inexpertly applied by panicked associates, failed. The building's medical team, then the city ambulance, arrived too slowly. A standard tragedy, the initial coroner's report would note, albeit with a private addendum about the odd witness statements. Nothing overtly suspicious, except for the timing and that bizarre final utterance to an unseen listener in an empty chair that the maitre d' insisted had been unoccupied the entire evening. The third death, completing the terrible triptych, occurred aboard a luxury yacht cruising the azure waters off the coast of Capri, Italy. Arthur Marquez, 61, the eldest brother, the stern patriarch and CEO of Heliogrid Industries, the foundational energy arm of the Marquez Empire. He had been sunning himself on the yacht's expansive teak deck, a glass of his favorite limoncello resting beside him. According to the ship's captain, a seasoned mariner with decades of experience, it had been a perfect Mediterranean day. Calm seas, a gentle breeze, not a cloud in the sky. Arthur's heart, a robust organ that had weathered countless boardroom battles and hostile takeovers, simply stopped. No preceding arrhythmia, no gasping for breath, no desperate clutch at the chest. His glass of limoncello sat undisturbed, its contents barely trembling. He looked up, the captain recounted, his voice hushed with awe and a touch of fear, straight up into the clear sky, as if he were watching something fall, something only he could see. Then he smiled, a peaceful, almost beatific smile, and then he just dropped, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The captain was adamant. Was anything falling? Nothing. The sky was clear blue. No birds, no planes, no distant contrails. Nothing. Just emptiness. 3 brothers, 3 bizarre, inexplicable ends, 3 separate corners of the globe.
Each death, when viewed in isolation through the lens of extreme, almost supernatural misfortune, might have been compartmentalized. A freak lightning strike, a tragic choking incident with odd behavioral precursors, a sudden, unexplained cardiac arrest under a clear sky. Until you looked at the timestamp, meticulously cross-referenced through international atomic clocks. They died at the exact same moment. October 25th, 2025, 14:37:11, Coordinated Universal Time. Down to the second. I remember the emergency press conference vividly. Miles Finch, usually a man of imposing confidence and sartorial perfection, looked diminished, exhausted. His bespoke suit seemed to hang a little looser on his frame. His usually sharp, piercing eyes were shadowed, his skin unnaturally pale under the harsh glare of the television lights. His voice, when he finally spoke, was carefully measured, almost unnaturally calm, like a mathematician attempting to explain the intricacies of Gödel's incompleteness theorems to a baying mob wielding pitchforks and lit torches. After a thorough and exhaustive preliminary investigation, Finch stated, his gaze sweeping across the sea of skeptical, predatory faces of the world's press, there is currently no discernible evidence to suggest coordinated foul play in the tragic deaths of Arthur, Elliot, and Damien Marquez. The initial findings point towards 3 separate, albeit statistically improbable, fatal events.
But no one believed him. You could feel the collective disbelief in the room, a palpable wave of incredulity and suspicion. Not the seasoned reporters, their notebooks poised, their questions already sharpened like daggers. Not the global public, watching live, their social media feeds already exploding, with theories ranging from targeted assassinations by rival corporations to arcane vendettas. Certainly not the surviving Marquez family members, their grief quickly curdling into a furious demand for answers that Finch clearly didn't possess. How could 3 brothers, bound not just by blood, but by the intricate, often contentious threads of a vast business empire, co-owners and key operators of a multinational renewable energy and technology conglomerate that had its fingers in everything from solar farms in Chile to AI labs in Singapore, die at the exact same micro-instant, thousands of miles apart, in 3 such utterly disparate and bizarre accidents? Coincidence, Finch insisted, his voice strained but firm. An extreme statistical improbability, certainly, but not a metaphysical impossibility. He spoke of rogue electrical phenomena, of rare physiological responses, of the law of large numbers, meaning that even astronomically unlikely events must eventually occur. But deep down, I think even Finch didn't fully believe his own carefully constructed explanations. I saw it in the flicker of doubt in his eyes, in the subtle tightening of his jaw. I think he knew, as I was beginning to suspect with a cold, creeping certainty, that something far darker, far stranger was at work, something that operated entirely outside the established boundaries of conventional logic and forensic science. They were connected, somehow, not by assassins' bullets or synchronized cyber attacks, but by invisible, intangible threads that didn't follow Newton's laws or Einstein's relativity in any conventional sense. by a ripple, a profound disturbance, a quantum butterfly effect, traced not through the predictable mechanics of air currents and temporal succession, but through the twisted, interconnected corridors of probability itself, through the very fabric of space-time.
This is what some of us, in hushed whispers and encrypted communications, would later come to understand and theorize as macroscopic quantum entanglement, manifesting as a kind of quantum sympathetic resonance, or, more poetically, the quantum butterfly effect. The unnerving idea that a definitive event in one specific location, a collapsed wave function, a sudden, irreversible shift in a quantum state, could instantaneously ripple across the intertwined probability fields of other entangled systems, no matter how vast the physical distance separating them. These men, these brothers, were not just genetically related. They had built an empire together, their lives, fortunes, and perhaps even their core identities inextricably interwoven. They had shared assets, strategies, triumphs and failures, shared thoughts, arguments, and alliances. Perhaps, in some way none of us yet understood, they had come to share a collective fate, their individual wave functions so deeply entangled that the collapse of one necessitated the collapse of all. Finch, a man whose entire career was built on the bedrock of empirical evidence and rational deduction, couldn't accept such a premise. It was anathema to his world view, to his very being. He spent weeks, then months, drowning in data. He pored over telemetry from Zermatt's weather stations, seeking any trace of anomalous atmospheric conditions. He scrutinized every frame of security footage from Shibuya Tower, every financial transaction Elliot Marquez had made, every psychological profile. He commissioned independent analyses of the yacht's systems off Capri, GPS data, oceanic reports, Arthur's complete medical history. He hired physicists to explain away the lightning, neurologists to dissect Elliot's final words, cardiologists to find a hidden flaw in Arthur's health. He consulted with electrical engineers, materials scientists, even forensic meteorologists. Nothing, no conventional explanation held water. Every logical avenue led to a frustrating dead end, a maddening paradox. The universe seemed to mock his efforts.
And then came the inevitable, brutal backlash. The public, denied a neat, understandable villain, turned on the messenger. The media, initially respectful of his reputation, soon savaged him. Tabloids, with their characteristic cruelty, branded him Finch the Flummoxed, and the detective who couldn't count to 3 synchronized deaths. Satirical news shows ran skits depicting him comically bewildered by basic physics. Members of Parliament, sensing a political opportunity, publicly questioned his competence, his mental state, even his integrity. A once revered mind, a national asset, was reduced to a meme, a symbol of institutional failure in the face of an increasingly incomprehensible world. And so, with no answers forthcoming, no rational explanation to offer a world screaming for one, and with a quiet dignity that he refused to see further eroded by public ridicule and political opportunism, Miles Finch did what no one, myself included, ever expected. He vanished. Not disappeared in a puff of quantum smoke, not literally. He simply resigned his position. He closed his small, discreet consulting office in a quiet Mayfair mews. He left a single typed note pinned to the door, its stark simplicity a final defiant statement. I was hired to solve crimes committed by men, governed by motive and opportunity. I was not equipped, nor am I inclined to investigate the caprices of a universe that has apparently decided to rewrite its own fundamental laws. I leave you to your quantum shadows. The note was photographed, went viral, and became another fleeting sensation before being absorbed into the growing background noise of global bewilderment. Finch himself retreated from public life entirely, his current whereabouts a subject of much speculation but little concrete knowledge. I often think of Miles Finch, a man whose formidable intellect was perhaps too sharply honed, too rigidly structured for the fluid, probabilistic reality he found himself inhabiting. A brilliant mind shipwrecked on the shores of the impossible. He was right, in a profoundly unsettling way. These weren't murders in the classical, prosecutable sense. They were collapses, synchronizations, the dying echoes of something larger, a resonance in the quantum foam, a choice made somewhere by someone or by something, a complex quantum state selected from an array of possibilities that required a terrible instantaneous balancing of the cosmic ledger, an equilibrium restored through annihilation. The universe, it seems, doesn't like unresolved anomalies, doesn't tolerate certain kinds of entangled asymmetry for long. So it smoothed them out. 3 deaths, 3 precise, simultaneous acts of what could almost be seen as a brutal form of informational conservation. Logical in its own terrifying, inhuman way. Statistically mandated, perhaps, once the initial conditions were set, merciless in its execution, and completely, utterly unsolvable, unless you stop thinking like a detective bound by the chains of classical cause and effect. Unless, perhaps, you start thinking like a physicist grappling with the foundations of reality itself. Or maybe something else entirely.